many women need more stimulation with age because the sensitivity goes down. And so I really normalize the use of vibratory stimulation because it helps a lot, right? But sometimes it also helps for younger women. So like, this is less the case sometimes for young women because they don't need quite as much stimulation. And but I ask them, like, have they tried techniques for improving or enhancing stimulation? The biggest factor is that women kind of don't know their structures. The actual clitoris isn't the most sensitive. It's the sides of the clitoral, the flanks of it, right? The side, for example, around the vestibule, the sides of the clitoral hood, just inside where some people call the G-spot. These are where the neurovascular bundles are concentrated. That top of the clitoral hood is actually very easily irritated and doesn't like being rubbed very much. And like, so some partners are sitting there rubbing, like as an example. I mean, not to be too graphic. And so some education about vaginal, vulvar, and clitoral stimulation, techniques for stimulation. So I send people to books. I personally still send people, there's a number of books and we could talk about those. So that's where Bibliotherapy, looking at some really responsible lay press literature on like a book called Becoming Orgasmic. The Joy of Sex has been republished and published and published, and it's still a great book.
What year was the first version of that book?
I think it was that's a good question. I should have checked that for you, but I think it was in could it be the 70s? It might be soon. Is some decades ago.
Yeah.
Good question to find out. I mean,
okay, so the Joy of Sex. So rattle off the names of the books that you would use as reference here.
So, For Yourself, these are some books that I like. For Yourself, okay. Becoming Orgasmic, The Joy of Sex. Sandra Liedblum has a couple of different books. She's a sex therapist who's no longer with us. She had an unfortunate accident, but she's written several different books. Some of them, more of her work is on desire. Lori Brotto on mindfulness, and it talks a lot about learning how to stimulate yourself and create. So there's books, available. There's also a website. I have no commercial investment in any of this. I just want to make sure people know that I sometimes send people to. It's called OMG YES. I'm like, oh my God, yes, I guess.
So sorry, the website is just www.omgyes.com.
Yeah.
Okay.
I guess it's I just Google it and it pops up. Okay. OMG YES. Oh my God, yes. I mean, God is we'll just say it. That's what I think it is.
Yep.
And it's a very responsibly produced website that has a lot of education for women, including, so you have to have there's a small amount of money for a subscription. I think the standard program's like around $40, and then there's a larger fee for a more involved program. It's not free, but they have some demos on it. And it has a lot of educational videos, including very explicit videos on showing techniques for clitoral and other kinds of stimulation, and really teaching people to learn how to stimulate themselves and become orgasmic.
And so is this a site that is also just as helpful for men or female partners of other women?
Right. It's designed for female stimulation.
Yeah.
But it could be for the partner.
Could be for the partner just as much for the individual.
And sometimes it's easier for someone to sit and watch a video with their partner than to have to show them themselves. Yeah. So it's not uncommon that they'll say, well, you could start by yourself and figure out which videos you might want to watch with your partner. Okay. So that's another example. There's some other resources, but those are some common things that I would do with that patient. You can send the person to a sex therapist too. And I'm not a sex therapist. I counsel. So when we haven't talked a lot about psychological therapies. There is some data for using mindfulness-based therapy and cognitive therapy for an array of sexual disorders. For anorgasmia, the sex therapists use much more explicit techniques. So they use things like directed masturbation. So you could send them to a sex therapist. I make the distinction. I counsel and I give advice, and I'm a medical physician who does kind of a multifaceted analysis and intervention. But if I think they need more work, I might suggest that patient go to a sex therapist. And so the techniques for learning about orgasm with a sex therapist might be, for example, directed masturbation. It's kind of some of what we're talking about, but they might instruct them more. These sex therapists these days, it's not like if you saw, again, Masters and Johnson, they don't go behind a room with a glass window and like have sex in front of the sex therapist. There are surrogates. That's not what I'm talking about. But they'll discuss very, very, in more detail about technique, and they'll give homework assignments. There may be advice or guidance about positioning. So they might bring the partner in and discuss positioning. They might use something called sensate focus. So a lot of times people, in addition to that, we didn't kind of get into this yet, but people develop a lot of anxiety, right? So, and that makes the problem worse. They develop like what's called spectatoring and performance anxiety. So there's a technique that works for any sexual dysfunction, but can be used here, where you gradually introduce levels of sexual and partner communication. And you start with very non-threatening things, like you sit, you hold hands, you hug, and a couple is given gradual, especially when people become very anxious that like, am I going to have an orgasm? What's going to happen? So the sensate focus prescription can be done by sex therapists. And then sometimes more so with like distraction and low desire, mindfulness and cognitive therapy can be introduced by by people who specialize in this. So that's something I might like and then the other thing we didn't mention is sometimes I discover like a really deep-seated and important psychological issue that's linked to this. Like an unfortunate scenario would be someone who's sexually traumatized. Mm-hmm. And like every time they get into or they develop even like a genital aversion, right? There used to be something called sexual aversion disorder that's been kind of removed from the DSM for a variety of reasons. But every time they enter a sexual encounter, they'll have an intrusive thought, or maybe there's mixed in with PTSD, or there was very strong religious prohibition or cultural prohibition. And then if I pick that up, I really send them right to a psychological person to work with that, because it's something that's now they understand or come to realize may be interfering with their sexual quality of life and their happiness. So we didn't say that, but at the onset, that's much more primary,
yep.
Right?
Okay. Let's go back to the two drugs that we didn't talk about besides testosterone, just to make sure we close the loop on that.
Yeah, I think I'm glad you raised the whole point about office counseling. So a lot of what we're talking about before we move to the drugs is that there's office counseling like I would do, and we didn't get into this so explicitly, but I look at like, what's the relationship? What's the timing? What's the lifestyle factor? So I was thinking we were going to go there with that 39-year-old or however old we decided she was. I call it the rant, right? So she'll come in and she'll say, I'll say, well, tell me what's going on. They'll be like, well, I have 2 kids. There's homework, there's dinner, there's I work all day, there's the house, there's the laundry. Then I have to answer my email at 12 o'clock, and then it's 1 a.m, and the partner wants to have, whatever partner it is, wants to have sex like I'm too tired.
Yeah.
You know? I mean, it's just, and sometimes they're not helping me gets thrown in there, right? And so a lot of what I do is dissect this back. I'm sure you do this too in your work, is help people look at how their lifestyle is. So that's that. So when someone comes to me with low desire, and I look at these lifestyle factors, we look at some of the other medication factors, we look at whether there's another sexual dysfunction like contributing to low desire, and they have hypoactive, meaning distressing low desire that's clinically diagnosed, and I don't see another modifiable factor. That's where in postmenopausal women, I might think, okay, do we need to add androgens, right? So we should say, like, first you do a biopsychosocial assessment before you use a pharmaceutical. And you look at these factors, you look for relationship counseling factors, you look at referrals for psychotherapy or sex therapy, and you look at modifiable medications, other things you can change. And then if you reach the point where you're like, I want to use something explicitly for sexual desire, in postmenopausal women, you can use testosterone. Like, that's an option. We didn't talk about who the candidates are and when you would use that. The biggest hitters are people who've had oophorectomies at a young age, or early menopause, postmenopausal women with distressing low desire. And then, you have to, of course, do informed consent when you do that.